There is an easy assumption that if a country has abundant natural resources, it will tend to be richer than a country that does not. But do a country's land area, population, or climate really have any relationship with the wealth of its people? What is it that makes one country become rich while another becomes poor? We asked ourselves this question and discovered far more than we had imagined. We invite you to explore the factors that influence the wealth of nations and find out whether we can predict how the future of each country might unfold. Having a large territory can certainly be an advantage for a country. The larger the territory, the more natural resources it is likely to contain, for example. At the same time, if a country has both a vast territory and a large population, it has the opportunity to develop a sizable domestic economy that can help drive economic growth. All of this sounds quite logical, but reality is far more complicated. If we look at the list of the richest countries in the world, we find an extraordinary variety of geographical characteristics. Some are tiny countries such as Singapore or Qatar. Others are giants such as the United States. And there are also countries of medium size such as Norway. The same pattern appears when we look at the bottom of the rankings. Among the poorest countries in the world, there are small nations such as Timor-Leste and Haiti, enormous countries such as the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and medium-sized countries such as Myanmar. At first glance, it becomes clear that the size of a country's territory alone cannot explain its level of wealth, and there are many reasons why no correlation exists between these two factors. For example, a large country must devote enormous effort to managing its territory effectively. Think about some of the most basic responsibilities of a government, such as protecting its borders, enforcing the law, collecting taxes, or maintaining security. Every one of these tasks becomes significantly more difficult when a country has an enormous territory. Likewise, a larger country must invest much more in infrastructure to connect its different regions. In addition, large countries often contain vast areas that are extremely difficult to develop. Consider Australia or Algeria, both of which have immense territories but also contain enormous deserts where there is very little that can realistically be developed. However, even natural resources themselves are not a reliable predictor of wealth. Some countries possess tremendous resource potential because of what lies beneath their soil, such as Venezuela and Angola, yet they remain far from being considered wealthy. Even the domestic market we mentioned earlier can become a trap. For some countries, it may have been an advantage during a certain period, but over time, protectionist policies inevitably lead to products that are more expensive and of lower quality. So let us consider what other factors might explain the differences in wealth among countries. The first thing that comes to mind is climate. Countries with more favorable geographical conditions would seem to have an advantage from the very beginning. But once again, a quick look suggests that there is no clear relationship. Within the tropical zone, many of the world's poorest countries are located. Yet there are also countries with exceptionally high GDP per capita, such as Singapore, the United Arab Emirates, and Guyana. On the other hand, the temperate regions located between the tropics and the polar circles appear to provide some of the most favorable conditions for human settlement. However, although many wealthy countries are found there, we also see numerous examples of poorer nations, such as Afghanistan in the Northern Hemisphere and Lesotho in the Southern Hemisphere. Another correlation that came to mind was the level of urbanization. It seems reasonable to think that countries with a higher percentage of their population living in urban areas would be wealthier than countries where most people live in rural areas. However, in reality, this idea is not supported by the evidence. Nauru and Gabon have urbanization rates of more than 90% of their populations, yet they have not achieved a high standard of living. On the other hand, Liechtenstein is one of the richest countries in the world, but only a small portion of its population lives in urban areas. Now let us become a little more creative and think of something else. In many places today, people believe that reducing taxes can generate economic growth. However, we found countries with very high taxes that are still extremely wealthy, such as Denmark, France, and Sweden. At the same time, there are also wealthy countries with much lower tax burdens, such as Singapore and the United States. Among poorer countries, the differences also exist. Some have low taxes, such as Bangladesh and even Paraguay, while others have higher tax burdens, such as Nauru or Nicaragua. Therefore, we ruled out this hypothesis as well. Another economic topic worth considering is public debt. We might assume that a country with less foreign debt would have greater opportunities for development. However, there are many examples that contradict this idea. Japan and Singapore have very high levels of debt relative to the size of their economies, yet they remain wealthy countries. Meanwhile, Haiti and the Democratic Republic of the Congo have considerably lower levels of debt, yet their standards of living are much lower. Come on, let us explore another possibility: tourism. Countries that attract large numbers of tourists should have a significant advantage because they earn foreign currency from abroad. There are some cases that fit this hypothesis, but there are also many examples that do not. Cambodia and Jamaica welcome large numbers of tourists, yet they still have not been able to achieve strong economic development. Let us propose one more hypothesis, and this will be the last one. We have no doubt that education is the key to development. However, the level of investment in education by itself does not appear to produce decisive results. There are countries with very high incomes that spend relatively little on education as a share of total public expenditure, such as Monaco, Andorra, and Singapore. On the other hand, there are countries such as Cuba, Bolivia, and Mozambique that invest heavily in education but remain much poorer. After considering all of these possibilities, we had almost run out of ideas. At that point, we concluded that it was unlikely that a single cause could explain something as complex as the wealth of nations. So we began investigating whether anyone had already studied a similar question, and we found this. According to that research, a country's wealth is explained by many different factors that must exist simultaneously. Put simply, a country has a higher level of economic complexity when it exports a diverse range of products that only a small number of other countries in the world are capable of producing, especially if those countries also possess highly diversified economies. Economic complexity reflects the productive capabilities and knowledge embodied in the different products that a country knows how to manufacture. Therefore, a country that exports X-ray machines, such as Germany, will have a higher level of economic complexity than a country that exports only cocoa beans, such as Côte d'Ivoire. To conduct this research, modern artificial intelligence and physics techniques are used to estimate the presence of a wide range of factors within an economy. Because we believe that this approach could be useful, we decided to explore it in greater depth. The researchers who developed this theory also created tools to explore these ideas, such as the Observatory of Economic Complexity, which has continuously published economic complexity rankings since 2011. Using the data they have collected, they regularly produce rankings based on trade, technology, and research. If we look at the rankings for the most recent year, among the 10 countries with the highest levels of economic complexity, we find small countries such as South Korea, medium-sized countries such as Germany, and very large countries such as the United States. Likewise, if we examine the countries with the lowest levels of economic complexity among the 132 countries that were analyzed, we find very large countries such as the Democratic Republic of the Congo, medium-sized countries such as Afghanistan, and smaller countries such as Nicaragua. Once again, this allows us to confirm that the size of a country's territory is not closely related to its level of prosperity. Economic complexity is not a ranking of land area or population, because what it measures is the presence of complementary capabilities and productive capacities within an economy. It is an indicator that tells us that many of these capabilities are present in countries such as Singapore, Switzerland, and Japan, while only a few are present in countries such as Mali, Mozambique, and Haiti. In this way, the index can also be used to understand how an economy changes over time. It does not merely describe the present situation, but also predicts future economic growth. India and China have higher levels of economic complexity than would be expected based on their income levels, which means they have stronger growth potential than countries such as Oman or Qatar, for example. Those countries have very high GDP per capita, but their levels of economic complexity are not correspondingly high. In fact, this research even includes a separate section dedicated to predicting which countries are expected to perform the best over the next 7 years. According to this methodology, The country expected to achieve the highest growth in GDP per capita is India, followed by the Philippines and Uganda. Rounding out the top 10 are countries from 4 different continents. Among the 87 countries that were analyzed, 5 are projected to have unfavorable outcomes and become poorer than they are today. With the exception of Mongolia, all of them are countries that depend heavily on oil exports. Time will tell whether these predictions continue to prove accurate. We will set a reminder for the year 2033 to see just how accurate these forecasts turn out to be. Do you think this method could be useful for analyzing the prosperity of countries? Leave your comment below.